Ahoy! Hi-Rez has done it again. They've created an item that divides the SMITE community. And this item is Griffonwing Earrings. Coming in the mid-season patch, it comes with some power, attack speed, MP5, and a very interesting passive. Your basic attack projectile speed is increased by 40%. Your basic attack damage is reduced by 15%. Now, you may already have watched some people use this item, and depending on who you watched, they may have praised or not praised this item, but it doesn't really matter, because in tradition for Hi-Rez, this item is bugged and the passive doesn't work as intended. Before I demonstrate this, let's have a brief summary of the sentiments that I've generally seen towards this item. There's one camp that thinks this item is going to be really broken, typically on specific guards, specific interactions, that will somehow make it completely busted and it'll probably get nerfed immediately. And the other camp that says this item is pretty much going to be completely useless. In order to really find an answer here, we need to test a bunch of things, and that's exactly what I did. And I did not expect this to take so long, because I actually had to sync up a ton of clips for this, but it's finally done. So let's talk about Griffonwing Earrings and how they work on different guards. We begin with a demonstration of the bug. As I said, gameplays that we've seen so far don't really tell us how Griffonwing Earrings will really perform, and that is because the basic attack damage reduction isn't working properly. Have a look at both this Anhur and Freya clip that I'll show you here, where you can see the damage output with Griffonwing Earrings and then with other items that are equal in power and don't have any additional effects. In both cases, the damage dealt while using Griffonwing Earrings is slightly lower, but far from 15% lower. What I think actually may have happened is that potentially the decimal was just put wrong and it's actually 1.5% at the moment instead of the intended 15%. But as such, Griffonwing Earrings performed much better in any match that it was used in than it should, because you get an extra almost 15% damage on top of what you were supposed to have. So the downside this item is supposed to have by design is just not there. And no, this is not just a jungle practice bug, this also happens in actual matches. Let's actually do a little experiment here. See these two Izanami clips of throwing basic attacks? Go ahead and guess which one has Griffonwing and which one has RC, which is exactly equal in attack speed. And now if you want to, pause the video and tell me in the comments which one you think is the one that has Griffonwing. Would actually be interesting to see how many people can really tell which one this is. I'll tell you the answer in 3, 2, 1. Griffonwing is on the left side. You get that right? Well, you're wrong then, because I lied. Griffonwing is on the right side. But I did a little bit of a cheeky thing here. I synchronized by where the hits are hitting Odin and not where the animation of the attack begins, which you'll see makes a bit of a difference in visually being able to tell what's happening. What is not happening here, and that's why I synchronized this way, is any form of attack speed increase. The attack speed remains consistent, which is important because apparently there seems to be some bug going around, at least there's a clip going around, where Izanami's attack speed is somehow increased with this item. I don't know if that can be recreated or if the person made a mistake, but under the circumstances that I was able to test, even with more attack speed items and whatnot, it always stayed this way. Izanami's attack speed, with the return cycle included, did not go up with Griffonwing. The same is also true when using her attack speed steroid. An issue that I had while synchronizing clips is something you can see with Anhur. Sometimes the animations will not quite be the same on attacks. And if you can't synchronize by the end point where you hit a target and have to synchronize by the starting animation, it becomes a lot more difficult. I tried my best, but as you can see, it doesn't always look perfectly synchronized. And that sometimes can make it harder to tell how much faster the Griffonwing projectile is actually hitting the target. But when we slow things down and just take a look at the projectile itself, we can definitely notice a difference in speed. Some of the animations of the character actually seem to be a bit cut short, along with the projectile animation at the start of the attack. It kind of comes off at a further point, and then the projectile also travels faster. But if we have to go to such length to even be able to fully visualize the difference, then is the difference itself very noticeable? Well, when it comes to Anhur, I would say no. If you look at this side-by-side comparison of just using it on the Odin bot with no further aim, literally just holding your left mouse and dragging back and forth, there isn't really that much of a difference between them. But maybe Anhur just isn't the best example. Charybdis is interesting because she has multiple unique interactions. The first one is her third basic attack projectile, which is 3 projectiles instead. I synchronized these clips purely by Charybdis animation, not by the projectile, and you can see a noticeable difference in these 3 projectiles going off. I think you can even see that well enough without it being slowed down. I reckon this can be helpful when trying to land all 3 projectiles, but at the same time, if the item worked correctly, you'd also lose 15% of your damage on each of these projectiles. Charybdis 1 Spike Shot has increased projectile speed built into the ability. Using this, I could not really notice a difference though. I think the projectile is already so fast that this additional increase really isn't noticeable, if it is even applied on this effect in the first place. I don't know, I can't tell. When trying to track Odin, I started experimenting with leading the shots more or less just to get a feel for how different this really is, and I didn't really get the feeling that overall it felt much easier to aim with this new item. It did feel a little bit easier at times, but not giving up 15% of your damage easier. At this point, a quick reminder, if you're enjoying the video so far, please consider subscribing, clicking the bell, liking, all that stuff. This took up pretty much all of my PTS time, so it would be nice if it was worth it. But at least from a visual perspective, there seems to be a pretty significant difference between guards in how noticeable this effect is. And one of the skins that I found very, very obvious with this effect is the new Cupid skin, the Invader Zim skin. I think it helps that the projectiles are so small and brightly colored, because here you can really clearly see the difference in projectile speed between the normal shot and the Griffonwing shot on the right side. We have a similar situation on Ram, even though his projectile has a bit more of a trail, where you can also see the difference between a normal projectile and a Griffonwing projectile a fair bit more clearly. Another guard that I tried was Heimdallr, who also has relatively unique basic attacks. Here again, there is a slight difference, you can kinda see it, but it doesn't feel all too big either. Heim already has these massive chunky basic attacks that feel like they're relatively easy to hit anyways. That brings us to the spicy section, beginning with Hachiman, where we can see the difference fairly clearly. When we're using his extended basic attacks from his 1, we can actually see that the projectile on the Griffonwing version on the right side hits a fair bit more quickly than it does on the left side, because the travel path is longer, so obviously a 40% reduction overall has more impact. The same percentage, but a larger effective amount of time taken off. And this time, it was absolutely noticeable when tracking Odin. I could really stand towards the end of where the projectile is and still just aim slightly ahead of Odin and I would hit him when I had Griffonwing. It felt more like aiming at max distance with a normal ranged attack rather than with the extended ranged attack distance. Even when aiming straight at the body, the shots would still land fairly often at that distance, though keep in mind that Odinbot is slightly slower than a player because a player would also have boots and also obviously move more erratically. If I had just one physical hunter to use this item on, it would be Hachiman. It's very unfortunate that the damage is currently bugged, so we can't actually find out if his 1 is even meant to be affected, because his 1 in its description says that he fires a series of arrows instead of basic attacking. These are in a way empowered basic attacks, and normally they scale off your basic attack damage, but I don't know if a reduction like this will apply to him, and this is also a question for some magical guards that we'll get to. If the reduction is not applied during his 1, that would obviously make it even better. Without that, it's still worth keeping in mind that your basic attacks at any other point are still going to be reduced, but since this is likely more of a late game item anyways, this may not be the biggest issue. Being able to reliably land those long-range basic attacks and get a lot of damage off your abilities otherwise may just be enough for Hachiman specifically. At this point, I'm absolutely not saying this is going to be a core item on him or anything like that, but it's something where I'd say, try it out and see how it feels for you. The same is true for Xbalanque's ultimate as well, but since it's only on the ult, you will proc it much less often or get the full benefit much less often, and Xbalanque also works less off of ability damage, so he relies more on his basic attack damage than Hachiman overall, so I wouldn't recommend it in the same way. There are some magical ADCs that I want to talk about as well. The first one is Freya. You can visualize the difference here, it is not massive, but it's there, and we also don't know how in her case the scalings will be changed when the item works properly in terms of damage reduction, so she may not suffer the same damage loss that others do. But here's the thing, Freya's basic attacks are fat. Sometimes the hardest part of hitting a Freya basic attack is not actually hitting it on the guard, but not having it clip on a minion on the way to the enemy guard. What is important is for Freya to dump as much damage out while her 2 is active as she possibly can. And in that regard, I think Hastened Ring is kinda in direct competition with Griffonwing, because they kind of share somewhat similar stats, and if you put both into a build, then you're probably going to suffer on the overall DPS side. And if I had to choose an item that assists my aim and damage capabilities on Freya, it would most certainly be Hastened Ring over Griffonwing, because Hastened Ring procs so well in combination with her too, and the chase potential is so much higher that a little bit of extra projectile speed, in my opinion, cannot compare. I also wanted to test an ADC with more normal basic attacks, so I took Chronos. Now, I'm not sure how different the projectile speed of Chronos basic attacks nowadays is from other hunters. I remember it being adjusted to be faster than some mages at some point, but I don't know if it's exactly the same speed as hunters, but I expected to at least notice a fair bit of a difference, when in reality it didn't feel all that different. Yeah, it was still somewhat noticeable, but not to a degree where I'd say that I got massive value or better aim out of it. On the contrary, I partially noticed, as with some other hunters as well, that having Griffonwing actually threw my aim off. That's because when I'm not using Griffonwing, I know how much I have to aim ahead of a character to catch them with a basic attack, but that changes when I'm using the faster projectile. So effectively, some basic attacks that would normally hit will actually miss as well. And this is an adjustment that you will have to make in every single match, middle of the match, when you're buying Griffonwing. You basically have to instantly reset your muscle memory and aim your basic attacks with less prediction, which is interesting and I guess can be useful especially for newer players, but I think will be an obstacle for some more experienced players that have played a lot of hours on those guards. And of course, all this testing was done in a 0 ping environment, but I can only play in 0 ping or 230 ping on PTR, and also the item is bugged anyway, so you can't really get a real feel for how effective or less effective it would be when your damage reduction isn't applied, so it is just straight up stronger than it should be. So there wasn't really any purpose in going into actual matches with it, and we'll have to wait until it's fixed and until it's on live client to get like the perfect feel for what this item will be. What I can say for certain is that it is far, far from close to hit scan. It is a slightly faster basic attack projectile, and that's all it is. And in many fights, until a certain distance, you barely will feel the difference. It's really the very long-range basic attacks where you might get the feel for it, and then especially the extended basic attacks on Hachiman. Some people have compared this to Hastened Fatalis, and I was a huge fan of old Hastened Fatalis. Even in situations where Hastened Fatalis was not as DPS efficient as other options, for players like me that don't have the best aim in the world, I always thought there was big value in it, and I was very happy when eventually even the pros, especially Ataraxia, started picking it up and showing that there's even benefit in giving up some theoretical DPS on high levels of play just in order to guarantee those basic attacks. I can tell you right now that Griffonwing does not feel the same way as Hastened used to feel at all. I think the trade-off with Griffonwing is a whole lot bigger, especially when it's fixed, than it ever was with Hastened, where you just lose a little bit of additional extra stats compared to some other items. Again, nothing is set in stone until we've seen the fixed version on the live client, but so far I am not overly impressed with Griffonwing, and I think for most carries it'll not be the most effective option. Hachiman may be an outlier where it could be cool, and maybe there are others, but so far every interaction that I've been reading, that I've seen suggested, hasn't really made a big difference. Most characters that potentially could use this more effectively don't seem to do so based on the experience that I had with it. In the next days we'll talk about some other experiences. If you'd like to see that, please consider subscribing and clicking the bell if you haven't yet, so you get notified of that. Other than that, thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you for the next one soon. Duke Sloth, out.